Good evening, and welcome to We the People, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. My name is Joan Higginbotham, and I'll be your host for this evening's program. Well, have you heard that climate change is changing the way we look at life? It's getting hotter these days, and there's more bad storms, and that could possibly be climate change, or the effects of climate change. I don't know that much about it, so I'm going to learn with you tonight some of the things that are happening and that may change the way we look at life. Our guest this evening is Rebecca Montgomery, and Dr. Montgomery is with the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota. Welcome.
Well, thanks, Joan, so much for inviting me. I'd like to start out acknowledging the land on which we are talking as Dakota land, and acknowledging the traditional landowners of this place that we call Minneapolis. I would also just say that I think some of what we're going to talk about tonight is related to processes related to our colonization and industrialization, and that's part of the story of climate change that we'll be talking about tonight.
Well, it's been going on for a long time.
It has.
But, you know, the definition, I get global warming and climate change. They're not the same thing, but they're related. Yeah,
they are related. So climate change is really, to talk about climate change, we need to think about what's weather and what's climate. Weather is day-to-day patterns in things like temperature and precipitation. Climate are long-term patterns in things like temperature and precipitation. And climate change is when these global and also regional patterns of climate are changing from what they have been in the past. And we here in particular have been seeing directional changes in our climate over the last 40 to 80 years,
directional
which
means
we call climate change, meaning changing in this area, temperatures are tending to get warmer. We also, on average, are getting more precipitation, and so these patterns are changing, and that's climate change.
And it's changing enough so that we can really notice it. It's not
absolutely,
because I know that it's small changes, but I do know that we've had 500-year floods in every 10 years.
Yes. Yep. So that's one of the things that we've been seeing. The other thing we've been seeing is warmer winters. In our area, so our climate is warming here in Minnesota, and it's warming more in winters than it is in other seasons.
Really?
And we're also seeing more intense rainfall events, and so where we in the past would again have these 500-year rainfall events, those are happening much more frequently, and the intensity of the storm activity has been increasing. And those are all things that have been linked to what we call global climate change.
Now, so why is that? I mean, it's interesting to me to figure out, well, where is it's getting warmer? That I can understand, but more rain?
So when we change the atmosphere, which is the ultimate cause of these changes, and what we call global warming or global climate change, when we change the atmosphere, in particular, when we put heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere, that changes all kinds of things related to how the atmosphere relates to the land, which creates our patterns of weather. And so those changes, that increased heat-trapping ability of the atmosphere, has kind of cascading effects on things like rainfall and moisture and storm intensity. And those types of things associated with weather and climate.
Now, before we get too far down the road, 97% of all scientists believe this, but it seems like the 3% who don't all live in the United States.
Yeah, it's funny. I work most in the U.S. now, but I do travel a fair amount, and in most places other than the U.S., you don't start by trying to convince people that climate change is happening. They just say, well, it's happening, what do we do about it? But in the U.S., we have more skeptics than other parts of the world.
Well, I suppose that is sort of an American thing to be a skeptic, but I was surprised when I found that statistic, that it's 97%. It's just...
The science is overwhelming at this point, I would say, that our climate is changing globally and it has regional impacts.
Now, the other thing that I've heard people say is, well, it's just a natural occurrence and we shouldn't worry about it, and it's happens every 2,000 years or 5,000 years or whatever. Is that true to a certain extent?
That is not the case,
Oh.
actually. If we look at long-term records, all through the ice ages, so the past 400,000 years, where we went through major fluctuations in global climate, we are beyond where we have been in terms of the Earth's temperature and in terms of the CO2 levels in our atmosphere than any time in the last 400,000 years.
So it may have ebbed and flowed earlier, but not to the extent that it is now.
Or, not to the extent, and also we have changed it in a very short period of time. So this has happened in the last 150 or so years, whereas our ice age cycles were much longer than that.
Now, ice age, I would be thinking that would be like 30 degrees below zero kind of things.
Right, so ice age, when I talk about the ice ages, it's basically the period of time where we fluctuated from being a warmer planet to being in these colder periods where glaciers came down to this part of the globe.
So it was a cycle. How long would one of those cycles be? Long.
Long.
Yeah. Well, okay, so we've sort of said that's what's happening, but now we have to say it's our fault.
Right. So that's the other thing. I think a lot of people are starting to notice these changes. What's really critical is thinking about what's causing them and linking what's causing them to our actions. And people have been hesitant to do that. But again, the science and the data behind our impacts is very strong, that the vast majority of the warming that we are seeing globally is caused by elevated CO2 related to fossil fuel emissions and also to land use change, so deforestation that is taking the carbon that's stored in the trees themselves and releasing that into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide.
Now, what does CO2 do?
So CO2 is a heat trapping gas, and so when heat radiates from the Earth's surface to the atmosphere, that gas acts kind of like a shield that then reflects that heat back to the surface. CO2 is why we are here, why there is life on the planet, because if there was no CO2 in the atmosphere, all that heat would be lost and we would be too cold for life to exist. But again, we have moved the CO2 outside of the range it's been throughout the history of humans as a species, and that is creating problems.
So in other words, it's up there as almost like an umbrella.
Yeah.
And we needed a little umbrella to keep us from getting bad things, keeping the heat in to keep us warm, but now it's too much of an umbrella.
Yeah.
Trapping too much gas.
Yeah. Too much heat.
Too much heat, rather. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but so what does that have to do with recycling?
Well, recycling, it has some to do with recycling in the sense that the more we use renewable use of resources, the less we have to incinerate our trash, which releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the less we create landfills, which can also create methane, which comes out of landfills. So it's related to recycling. I would say it's more related to fossil fuel use, in particular, related to our habits of driving cars and our energy consumption and all the things that generate CO2.
So it is all the emissions from our automobiles and buses and everything.
Yep, from the power generation, so coal-fired power plants, natural gas fired power plants, oil usage, all of those things emit CO2, and that's one of the largest sources of this CO2 that's causing the
Now, I just
climate
remember
change.
somebody saying something about methane in cows.
Yeah, so methane in cows are part of the story too. So CO2 is probably the most common and most abundant greenhouse gas, but methane is also a greenhouse gas. It's less abundant, but it actually has stronger heat trapping properties.
Really? So it really is
does.
a problem.
So it is a problem.
But I don't think we have that
Yeah.
many cows that we have to seriously worry
Well,
about.
actually, one of the
really?
mitigation suggestions when we're thinking about how do we reduce our emissions is reducing methane production from agriculture,
Really?
which in part is from cattle industry.
Now that, I mean, it makes sense, but it's sort
Yeah.
of surprising to me that that's it.
That's a hard one for me actually, because one of the things that is also recommended with mitigation is using less resource intensive, eating less resource intensive foods. And methane producing foods, and I personally really like a steak every once in a while.
Yep.
So
You feel guilty when you eat it now. Right. Well, the big bad things are too much CO2 and too much methane. What are there any other things that we need to worry about?
in terms of contributing?
Yeah.
Well, some of the nitrogen-based gases are also heat trapping. Nitrous oxide, which is another thing that's emitted through fossil fuel burning, but I would say that CO2 and methane are probably our key components.
Now, how you said the storms, but now I know your area of expertise particularly is forests.
Mm-hmm.
So are we going to have palm trees in the woods of Minnesota?
We won't have palm trees, but the woods of Minnesota might look very different
Really?
in the future. The work that we've been doing suggests that some of our, say, iconic northwood species like spruces and firs are projected not to grow nearly as well, even with just a 1 to 1.5 degree increase in the temperature. And things like maples and oaks, which tend to be more common to the south. They go all the way to Georgia
Right.
and the southern areas. Looks like that they will actually really enjoy being a little bit warmer. But that means our forests might change over time to be less of the spruce, fir, kind of north woods feel, and more like deciduous forests. And some even suggest that we could have more prairie further north in the state if it becomes warmer and drier. Since
Have we
prairie
seen
is
any
much
changes in
more.
agriculture thus far? I mean, are farmers able to do different things?
So farmers are changing. There is evidence that they are shifting some of the timing of plantings, and I know less about whether they're shifting the kinds of cultivars that they're using, but has been some work that farmers are kind of adapting and changing their practices.
Really?
Because their growing conditions are changing.
Is the growing season getting any longer, or is it?
It absolutely is getting longer.
Is it really?
Yes, so one of the things I'm really interested in is phenology, which is the seasonal timing of things like leaf out and when plants flower, when the leaves change color and fall off of the trees. And I've been working with historical records that kind of naturalists have collected
sure.
in Minnesota.
Fascinating.
Including one from Eloise Butler Wildflower Garden in Theodore Wirth Park. And those data show that some of these things are happening almost 2 weeks earlier in the spring. So we're having things leafing out and flowering up to 2 weeks earlier. And then also that they're holding leaves longer. Trees, for example, are holding leaves longer into the fall. So we have this longer growing season.
So like this year, the fall seemed to be a little later. I don't know if that was just because of the weather, but it could be something to do with climate change.
Yeah.
Well, now what about our city, our wonderful city of lakes and trees?
Yeah, our wonderful city of lakes and trees. I think one of the biggest things is just thinking about one, what kinds of trees that we're planting, and that given that we are expecting warmer conditions here and maybe drier conditions, especially in summer, that we could think about planting different types of species than we currently have. I think the other thing that's important is that in an effort to reduce energy use, the trees within the urban setting play a role in shading our buildings, shading our streets, and creating conditions that increase energy efficiency for buildings. One of the other things that trees are important for is our water in the city. So one of the things in the urban areas, when we get storms, all that water falls on surfaces like pavement and roofs, that the water doesn't go into the ground in place. It goes down the street and into the storm sewer and out into our lakes and to the river. And so one role trees can play is actually intercepting the rainfall before it hits the ground, and also funneling down its stem into the ground around it. So reducing the amount of water that's falling on these surfaces that the water can't be absorbed, and reducing what's going into our lakes and rivers.
Well, also, if that were the case, then you wouldn't have to water as much either. And that's another bad thing is
that's possible too.
Well, now, but the thing that I also read something about this could have an impact on our lakes here in the city.
The impact is really, I would say, going to depend on a number of factors related to how much warming versus what happens with our rainfall. So when it's warmer, there's more heat to evaporate water off the lakes, which could reduce lake levels somewhat. But when it's warmer, we have these more intense rainfall events, which could lead to more water flowing into those lakes during storm events, for example. And I would say probably the biggest impact of that is the more water that flows from the land into the lakes, the more likely that we will get nutrients from the land in those lakes, which then can cause algae blooms and water quality that isn't desirable for those people that live around the lakes or walk around the lakes or want to swim in the lakes in the summer.
Yeah, and so that would be the same thing as if you're fertilizing your lawn, and instead of having it sink into the ground, if you have a lot of rain, it'll just wash it all into the sewer system. So that is not another negative thing. Well, now, so we talked a little bit about, what about different species? I mean, I read someplace that it might change, that we might lose some of our different, like bugs or something or another because of the change in climate.
Yeah, well, one of the things that, because plants and animals are adapted to their climates, and they have particular climates in which they really thrive. When those climates change, if it gets warmer, if it becomes drier, if it gets warmer and wetter, the species that can grow and thrive in those conditions might change. And that might lead to loss of species. It also may lead to gain of species. And I'm thinking, one way we can lose and gain species is if they become not so common here, go extinct here, but maybe are occurring further to the north, so sort of migration of species. But another way is by changing how species interact with each other. So for example, pests that may feed on plants or attack trees, if they become more abundant, or if warmer climate means that some of the controls on them, like getting frozen in the winter and killed, are gone, then we may see greater levels of, say, insect outbreaks and damage that then could affect the plants on which they feed, for example.
Isn't that one of the problems with the emerald ash borer, that we could have been spared something if the winters had been colder, and they haven't been recently?
Yeah, Possibly. I don't know the cold threshold for emerald ash borer. The one species that I think a lot of people talk about in relation to climate change, which is not a problem here in Minnesota, but is certainly in other parts of the US and Canada, and that is mountain pine beetle, which is a beetle that kills pine trees and has had a massive outbreak. And part of the reason for that outbreak is that they weren't getting killed in the winter. Another thing that insects can do sometimes if it's warmer is they can reproduce twice, have kind of two life cycles, right? So that sort of doubles the amount of offspring that they have, which also leads to more outbreaks.
Now, I heard someone also talk about the effect that worms have on trees.
Yeah, earthworms. It's interesting. I think there's more awareness on this now, but the worms that we see here in Minnesota are not native to Minnesota.
Oh, really?
Most parts, if not all parts of North America that were glaciated, the worms have not returned. Native worms have not returned to these systems after glaciation. And so all the worms we have here are ones that were brought here generally from Europe, some are from Asia. And the problem with them in our forests is that our forests have developed without worms, and so the worms actually really alter a lot, especially about the soil, in a negative way for trees. So they make the soil more compact, and so that they become more dry. They also move nutrients from the surface, where many of the plants put their roots out, deeper within the soil and less accessible to some of the plants.
Surprising. I thought the worms were always good.
Yeah, that's a common
Not
misconception.
necessarily.
That's right, yeah.
Well, we haven't talked very much about what I can do or what you can do to make things better. What are things that people can do?
Yeah, an interesting, just in October, actually, a new report came out from the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the report was really focused on what we need to do to keep us at below a certain level of warming, above our current average, and what happens if we don't meet that or go above that. And then also telling us and talking about ways that we can keep our the climate from going too high. And so a number of the things that they put forward really had to do with reducing our CO2 emissions.
So that's the biggie.
Reducing those emissions. Anything we can do to bring those emissions down are important. And something that I thought was actually pretty startling about the report is that to maintain us on a trajectory to only warm by about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit.
In which period of time?
By the end of this, ever, to not go beyond that level of warming for globally. We need to reduce our CO2 emissions by almost 50% in the next 10 to 15 years.
10 to 15 years?
And to almost zero by 2050.
So, but that's basically, we can't drive our cars anymore, is that?
So yeah, I mean, it was striking to me, and it was striking because I think, I'm not sure can we do that, right? But they made a lot of suggestions about things we can do. The number one thing is reducing CO2 emissions, and one way we can do that is reducing energy demand. So reducing the amount of energy we use by increasing energy efficiency of our homes and of the things that we use in our homes. Increasing renewables, so switching from fossil fuel intensive energy to renewable energy sources such as solar, wind, and bioenergy.
So that would really be one of the big ones here in
That would
Minnesota.
be
I
a
mean,
big one.
we have some guidelines that we're trying to hit.
Yep. Coal seems to be one of the big offenders, so reducing our reliance on coal. We need to reduce our coal use more than oil, because coal production and use of coal for energy has a higher impact on CO2 emissions. Other things that have been brought up are, as I mentioned before, is thinking about our methane emissions from agriculture. And one of the things that the report actually brought up was that if we continue kind of an energy intensive, high emitting lifestyle, we will need to rely more on carbon capture type technologies. So things that can take the CO2 out and store it someplace. And those are being tested and tried, but are
10 to 15 years away.
They're not really online in very many places here, and there's still some uncertainties about them. Other things that related more to the things I study is restoring ecosystems, so that they can so that the land and water ecosystems can actually help us out through the process of absorbing CO2
so they will filter
from the atmosphere. Yeah, so plants, when they photosynthesize, which is what they use to make sugars that then we eat, they take CO2 out of the atmosphere. So plants can help us. And so planting trees can be a strategy, as well as reducing the amount of deforestation that's happening globally.
So what's happening in the Amazon forest is not a good thing.
That's correct. So that is one of the contributors to elevated CO2 is deforestation and loss of forests. So there's been a call for, can we intensify agriculture in place sustainably to keep from deforesting? Because a fair amount of deforestation is to convert to agriculture,
right,
for production of corn and soybeans and other crops.
So if you were going to say to the average citizen, driving your car less perhaps, planting trees actually would be a good thing.
Reducing energy use at home, so increasing your energy
maybe using
efficiency.
Solar energy in your home would be one of those things. So those are all kinds
There's
of
all
things.
things that individuals can do. I think we also need to really use our ability to really convince businesses and
so
industry
the government
to make
and
the
business
change.
needs to
Yeah.
do things differently.
Yeah,
Well,
because they are kind of a big contributor, and so
to
being
that.
able to
I
make
hope you've
changes
gotten some
there.
good hints tonight from this about what the problem is and how you, as a citizen, can be a part of it. Thank you so much, Rebecca. This was really interesting, and I think we've all learned a lot. Our guest this evening was Rebecca Montgomery from the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota. And this is Joan Higginbotham for the League of Women Voters saying good night, and thanks for tuning in to We the People.